Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I am delighted to welcome Lauren Groh-Wargo with Fair Fight Action. Welcome.
Thank you, Jen. So glad to be with you.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit, Frank, first of all, about your group.
So, Fair Fight Action is a national voting rights group rooted here in the South. I'm coming in from Atlanta, Georgia. And what we do is expose the right wing and anti voter efforts to undermine our elections. And then we work to build political power and voting power specifically in the South, which is why I'm talking to you today, because just yesterday we released a second report on a huge pending case in the Supreme Court about voting rights, as you know.
Talk to us before we get there to an action that has taken place in Fulton County specifically. What's going on there?
Fulton County has been the one of the key local areas around the country. There are a couple other counties in a couple other states where the voter suppression and election denialism network has been unrelentingly relitigating the 2020 results. Your viewers, of course, remember that Joe Biden won in November 2020, and then we elected two US senators the day before what was then an insurrection. And all of that was making history, and all of that was really driven by incredibly strong turnout overall, and specifically strong turnout by Black voters. And so in Fulton County, your viewers may remember there was an unbelievable attempt to overthrow the results. So between the November election and the January runoffs, we had Rudy Giuliani come to the state. We had local election workers, Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, doxxed and put up on jumbotrons, their lives just wrecked. We had all the specious allegations of voter fraud, and Fulton County was the center of that. So in the past month, 2 months, the anti-voter network, led by people in the Election Integrity Network run by CLEDA, at the state election board, some of those folks locally and nationally, they have continued and they've sort of re-energized their fight around Fulton County. So just last week, I don't call it anything but DOJ, the Department of Injustice, guess we should say,
Yes.
sued my county. I live in Fulton County. I'm a Fulton County taxpayer and resident, trying to get access to documents and voter rolls and everything about the 2020 election. The state election board has been talking about all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories. They have strong ties to Trump White House. And we have seen just a compendium of actions by the Election Integrity Network and anti-voter actors to try to disrupt elections in Fulton County. And people are like, well, why are they relitigating 2020? I believe the speculation, well-informed speculation, that obviously it's not about 2020. It's about creating doubt around wins going forward. And
Yes.
obviously this is very selective. Fulton County is our biggest county in the state. It's majority African American. It's strongly majority Democrat, but we do have Republicans here, and there are a lot of them, and they also vote, Jen. But somehow the Republican state legislators that have districts here and others, those results are somehow fine. But somehow
Yes.
some other results are not fine. So we're in a big fight, right? Going into next year to protect Fulton County voters and taxpayers from, specious lawsuits, from attacks on our voter rolls, to just, some racially coded attacks, I believe, on Fulton County that are trying to create a pretense to disrupt elections next year. And we're seeing this all over the country. And I just happen to live in the county where there's a very acute fight. So that is kind of the breaking news down here, is that we've had the litigation and a whole set of actions in the late part of this year, I think gearing up to create pathways for disruption next year.
Before we get to Calais and the larger picture on voting rights in this country, I want to ask you about the deployment of National Guard troops. There has been speculation that what the regime is trying to do, I don't use the word administration because
Neither do
that
we.
denotes a legal system of rational governance. The regime seems to be acclimatizing the American people, or trying to acclimatize the American people to the spectacle of military troops on the streets of cities. How concerned are you that they have plans underway for next year to, if not disrupt elections, at least intimidate people, put military people on the street, something we have not had even during wartime in this country?
Look, I think that strategy, obviously, we all know is being deployed now with the way uh, ICE is being deployed. There was just a front page Atlanta Journal-Constitution article this weekend interviewing teachers and kids in DeKalb County, which is next to Atlanta, around how intimidating it is and how ICE has been around their schools. These are intimidation tactics as much as anything else. And that work is already being done, right? There's already preparing for voter suppression next year by putting ICE out in communities. We have seen Governor Landry in Louisiana, who's a real Trump sycophant, ask for National Guard in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, his predominantly black cities. We have seen the Guard deployed in Memphis, and a lot of challenges there that has created with racial profiling and the rest. So, in my view, the threat is already there, the mobilization is already happening, and it's all very anomalous and getting normalized now. And what's going to be interesting to me, that where I think it ties to Calais, is all of us on the ground in the South assume more of this is coming all next year, and certainly around election. And the way voter suppression works, it doesn't necessarily mean you got to move the early voting location into the sheriff's office, though we have seen that recently in Georgia. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a ton of law enforcement in front of a voting location, though we have seen that already in Georgia. Doesn't mean sometimes just the conversation that it might happen can have a chilling effect on civic engagement and voting.
Right.
And so I think we're already there, right? Everybody already knows it might happen. And so us and our allies and the really great voting rights coalition in Georgia and across the South are already talking about how we're going to think differently about what voter protection looks like in such an environment to really support voters and make them feel comfortable. And we're already seeing an incredible backlash to both bad
Yes.
policy and intimidation. Just last week, we won a gerrymandered state leg seat in the Athens, Georgia area that was gerrymandered for Republicans, and it was a Trump double digit win seat that we took for a Democrat. And then in November, while we were celebrating Virginia and New Jersey, oh my gosh, an absolute sea change. We elected two statewide Democrats, one of whom is a black woman, to the Public Service Commission. Those are statewide races, but the way they are run are engineered to help Republicans. And we won those by over 20 points. So right now in Georgia and across the South, we know there's a very heated conversation going on in Republican circles about how far do they go on intimidation tactics, on policy changes, because they're already seeing an unbelievable pushback. Because when we've dug into the voter roll results, what we're seeing in the PSC race in Georgia is two things. One, we're seeing high turnout, relatively high turnout from Democrats, strong support with white voters, Latino voters, black voters, Asian voters, much stronger support, and then diminished turnout of Republicans.
Yes.
So we're
Yes.
seeing a drop in enthusiasm that is quantifiable in these races, which is going to really, I already know it's flashing warning bells for their party down here. We're gearing up for legislative session to start, Jen, in here and a couple of other southern states right after the new year. So we start to get a lot more gossip and intel this time of year. We know it's a big
Gotcha.
conversation. And so I think those are going to be some of like the balancing act for our state leaders on all of this, right? Because I think if it just continues to be this egregious, we know from the Georgia races in 2020, 2021, when they go so over the top on voter suppression, it allows groups like us to name it, make it plain, make it clear, and say they wouldn't be trying so hard to suppress and intimidate your vote if your vote didn't matter. And we have seen the
Exactly.
power of a positive backlash to that because sometimes that action, people feel like, my right to vote, meh. When they're told, oh, don't do it, or we're trying to intimidate you out of it, people are like, oh, hell no, right? And so our mission is to do tons of voter education, do tons of voter protection work, think differently about it in this climate, and then make it empowering. This is our country. This is our state. And when you look at Calais, which we're going to talk about, and all of this, we're not going to let them turn the South back into a confederacy. That is what they are fixing to do. This is the
Absolutely.
region of the country that's 60% of Black Americans live in the South. So all of this has direct and indirect racial implications. And it's plain as day to voters down
Absolutely.
here. Everybody knows that.
So let's talk about Calais. That is a case for voters who may recall is about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. John Roberts already destroyed Section 5, which is the part of the Voting Rights Act that had been reauthorized on bipartisan basis since 1965, but that required that states, localities get pre-clearance if
Yes,
they had been in areas that had previously been, frankly, out suppressing the vote and violating people's
that's right.
rights. That's gone. So everyone said, don't worry, there's still Section 2. Section 2 is going to prevent gerrymandering that would harm representation, that would allow Blacks to and other racial minorities to express their voting preferences as cohesive communities. Well, slowly that has been worked away, worked away, worked away. Not too long ago, Supreme Court case, Calais went up to the Supreme Court, essentially saying the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. How could that be? It's in the Constitution. The post-Civil War amendments allow Congress to correct for discrimination, allow Congress to mandate protections. But that never stopped this Supreme Court. If this goes forward and essentially the wholesale attack on African American Latino voting rights goes forward, there are upwards of perhaps 20 seats that could be switched not only from Democrat to Republican, but the loss of Black representation altogether. We would be going back to pre 1965 voting, which means Blacks don't have a say. It is a white dominated one party state, and that is the Confederacy. What does your report tell us about all that
Yeah.
and the damage it would do to, frankly, the lives, the welfare of everybody in the South, not just African Americans?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have taken a look to see what the gutting of Section 2 would mean. And Section 2, part of the Voting Rights Act, is so important and powerful because it demands that racial minorities have an opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. And you don't have to prove that there was intentional discrimination. You have to look at the outcome. So you have to look at the outcome. And if you can reasonably say that there is racially polarized voting, yes, about 90% of Black Georgians tend to vote for Democrats. About 25% to 30% of white Georgians vote for Democrats. So that is definitionally racially polarized voting because this was never about party. It's about, is there racially polarized voting? Yes. And can a racial minority group elect their candidate of choice? And if the minority group is with a majority group in a district, that the majority group will not elect the minority group's candidate of preference. And
Yes.
looking at reasonable jurisdictions and districts. And so, why it's been so powerful and so meaningful to increase Black and Latino representation across the South and Sun Belt is because we've had growing populations of Latino voters, right? And we've had either growing or significant populations of Black voters in the South. So the Federalist Court on October 15th had a rehearing. They had already
Yes.
heard it in a previous term. And why the rehearing is important, it means they're probably not going to hold their decision until the end of the term. We would like them to, but there is a likelihood that this decision could come down any day now. Republicans in the South have been moving candidate filing deadlines, expecting a winter or early spring ruling. And what happens when you gut Section 2 is it allows right now, white majority Republican trifecta states to redraw the map and gut Black and Latino political power where they have a trifecta. Because in the South, unlike some of the listeners who have states with commissions that draw the lines, it is a straight state legislative process. Simple majorities in the House and Senate at the state level and governors tend to be how we do it down here, which means we have already gerrymandered legislatures. So that means it's white majority gerrymandered legislatures are going to make these decisions. So the decision we expect any day now, and they could then, and they're already chattering about redrawing the congressional lines. And I think the other important thing for contrarian listeners to remember is Section 2 doesn't just cover Congress and fair representation in Congress. It
Yes.
covers the state legislatures. It covers county and local districts. And
Right.
in a region of our country and in pockets in blue states where you have significant racial minorities, this is crucial to getting fair, balanced school boards and county commissions to make sure there's fair representation and to make sure that minority communities are not what's called cracked and packed so that their voting power is diminished because people tend to live in communities together. And so if you diminish their power or pack their power, then they're not having full voting rights. So we expect the decision to come down every day. The first report we released with Black Voters Matter Fund the week before the October 15th rehearing looked at the congressional impact. And this is real world, Jen, like just where do they have the power to do this, not some
Yeah.
academic thing. We estimate 19 seats could be redrawn, mainly in the South and Sun Belt. It would got about 30% of the Congressional Black Caucus, 10 to 15% of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and take us back in time in terms of Black representation, should they go all the way. Everybody's so worried about Texas. Texas could go back and probably draw 5 more seats without Section 2. It could get worse in Texas, for example. That 19, this is not looking at the current, it's taken into account the current partisan gerrymandering that's going on. But states have held back from doing some of the worst Section 2 redrawing, waiting to see what happens on this decision. So there's that. Can you imagine a Mississippi, 40% African American, having no Black representative to Congress? That's the kind of thing that a draconian change could make. Our second report, which we released again with Black Voters Matter Fund yesterday, is looking at what happened in the hearing, kind of recaps that. It also looks at what happened in elections since October, which shows us now that if states do this, they are playing with fire. There could be a huge backlash to this kind of racial gerrymandering because we're seeing such massive margins against Republicans. But we looked at the state legislative impact and why this is important. First of all, we care about it a lot in the South in terms of expanding Medicaid, for public schools, for not getting our books banned, right? For reproductive rights, for reasonable tax policy. There's so many reasons why state legislatures are important. But if you're listening to this and you're not in the South and you think this doesn't matter, well, you're wrong for 2 reasons. Number one, if this happens in the South, we become the incubation for even more terrible policy. Can you imagine replacing 10, 20, 30 Black legislators with a bunch of MAGA nuts? That is recipe for new constitutional amendments in the South, the independent state legislative theory, all kinds of proliferation of these far radical ideas would flourish in this type of dynamic. And then number two, you've got to care about it because everybody cares about most people care about having a competitive two-party Congress and a two-party country. You redraw the map down here, remember how we draw congressional districts. Those same people draw congressional districts, so things could get worse, right? And so it could put the South into a situation where the only contested election are Republican primaries. And that in this climate is not going to advance any issue that any reasonable person cares about. I don't care if you're moderate or very liberal. Now, here's the deal. How this goes this year really remains to be seen because we are in a very unusual time. And we're seeing results, narrow results in places like Nashville. Democrats winning the mayorship in Miami in a historic way. Democrats winning 2 statewide PSC races in Georgia. There is a lot in this moment of a potential wave election that I think in the new year, watching how Republican and MAGA leaders navigate this is going to be very interesting. How far do they go? How far do they try to go? Because if we can be winning 10, 20 points, I think that is different. But that's the partisan context of today. And you got to remember the Voting Rights Act is not about partisanship. It's about racial representation. And so this is a long fight, right? We might be able to survive 26 if we do all the things and slow it down and fight like hell. But what about 28? What about 30? If they draw Black voters out of districts, essentially, and Latino voters out of districts, the gutting of Black political power is the most expedient way for Republicans to achieve their political goals of white supremacy and political dominance. And
Absolutely.
so I think that's the thing that Americans have to understand is that we're all bound up in a multiracial democracy to have a two-party system, and we're all bound up in the future of the South. And so I think these are complicated topics, but they're also very simple, which is well-meaning people across the political spectrum, we do not want a one-party system. We need a
Exactly.
thriving two-party system. And for a stable democracy, we need fair representation and racial minority fair representation. And so we're hoping and we're continuing to work to build a really broad and deep coalition, which is another reason we're releasing these reports to instigate this conversation in state capitals, at the Contrarian, and everywhere, so that as we go into state legislative session next year, and as Trump demands this and that from everybody, that we start to see more courage, like we saw in Indiana out of Republican
Yes.
leadership, and
Yes.
we start to see an American conversation about the importance of Black leadership, not just for Black folks, but for all of us. So I
Exactly.
think it's every crisis is an opportunity, but we're living through a complete and utter changing of our entire voting and democracy system.
Absolutely.
And a year from now, when we're taking a breath after the November election, we're going to be looking at a whole new set of jurisprudence. We're going to be looking at a whole new set of issues. And we're going to really need to work to demand federal change as well as advance state level changes to really address this new thing.
Now, a couple things. As you said, Lauren, Indiana is an indication that actual Republicans, like, people who used to be Republicans, used to believe in, I don't know, rule of law,
Right.
limited government, all that kind of stuff. May not be everyone's cup of tea, but at least it was a coherent philosophy. Those people said no. They said, we don't want to go down this road. And they defied the president, which is a reminder that ultimately you don't have to do what the president tells you to do. You're independent. And in fact, you have an obligation to your constituents.
That's
The
right.
other factor here, and it does take some math. We had a wonderful explainer on our site. But when you try to redistrict to create more Republican districts, in order to spread out the African American vote or Latino vote, in order to move those out so that they don't have discrete representation, you're lowering the margin for Republicans in those districts. And what you're looking at in places like Texas is the very real possibility that after having gerrymandered to get a, I don't know, plus 10 Republican seat, that instead of picking up 5 seats, they lose 3 because the Democratic turnout is so great. And again, that's in partisan terms as
That's
opposed
right.
to racial terms. But that's kind of what we're looking at, which gives people a sense of what can we do about this? Well, the good news is there are elections, at
That's
least
right.
now, and that although we may have this miserable jurisprudence, these real fundamental attacks on pluralistic democracy, voters and voting still do matter
That's
a
right.
lot. I want to ask you about, and it doesn't seem immediately, people may not recognize the connection, but I sure do. We do here at the Contrarian, the Supreme Court. We have a Supreme Court that is massively out of control, that doesn't act like a court. It issues dictates without reasoning, without briefing. It departs from decades of jurisprudence. Looking ahead, what does the democracy movement need to do about the Supreme Court and about a body that is no longer playing the role it should be in a checks and balances system? It has created a king, says he's above the law, has done immense damage to civil rights. Where are we looking down the road 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is such an important conversation as we think about the future of voting rights in our country. The Federal Society judges, the Legal Defense Fund, Janae Nelson, argued the case for the good guys. And, they asked her to her face, well, isn't taking race in consideration, essentially taking racial representation in consideration itself racist? It goes to the thing you said at the beginning, which is how are we all twisted up here? So right now the court is using the constitutional 14th Amendment that protects against discrimination and map drawing. They're questioning or just straight up using it like they did last week in Texas to say that taking race into consideration is racist. So we are in the upside down because the 14th Amendment was to protect formerly enslaved Americans from discrimination, has been under
Exactly.
attack ever since then. But they are now in the Calais case, another example of using that against an argument for fair representation in our country. So, yes, we have to reform the Supreme Court. We have to win elections next year on whatever lines we have. Our maps that we drew consider a normal wave proof, which would be like 10 to 12 points. But the kind of waves we're seeing, we may be able to overcome that in many places on the partisan front. But it means that if we elect or flip state houses or win Congress, or I believe their gambit on voting rights is going to put the US Senate in play because we have so
Yes, I
many
agree with that. I absolutely agree with that.
Southern Senate races on the ballot. So we're then going to need to push the conversation federally about reforming the court and getting federal voting standards that are very real. And then at the state level, organize broadly to think about a new Voting Rights Act. We're working with colleagues across the region on what state bills can be introduced to look at proportional representation. We're going to have to attack it from both ends. And reforming the court has to be part of it because we need to have a federal court system. We're seeing the lower courts get it, and then things go and die at the Supreme Court, which has just become a
Exactly.
Trump rubber stamp. And so that is not a way to run a democracy. It is not a way, and even just the questions you're hearing asked at these hearings of these federal society judges, we need a change, right? And so we're going to need congressional action. We're going to need court reform. We're going to need federal voting standards to prevent partisan gerrymandering, right? That we need actual standards at that level, like we had in the Freedom to Vote Act in 2021 that failed. But we also have to do the state organizing. We have to do both. It
Absolutely.
reminds me a little bit of when Dobbs happened. Well, what's the
Yes.
answer? It's a lot of work at the state level to expand and protect women's reproductive health care, as well as a push on the federal side. And when our
Exactly.
fundamental rights are stripped, the way our government works is we have to be working in all of those different spaces at once. There's no one shot and there's no simple answer. But I think this court term is certainly making the case for court reform. We all knew it in
Absolutely.
Biden's term and we didn't get there. We all knew that we needed federal voting standards. We all knew we needed a reauthorization of the Federal Voting Rights Act. Had all of those things actually moved, we would have been in a very different situation in a second Trump regime. We would have had a lot more
Absolutely.
protections. But because of the failure of the Biden administration on all of this, unfortunately, we are where we are today with very little protections and a court that's out of bounds. So, to your point, in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that's the mission, right? And our mission at Fair Fight and Fair Fight Action is to build as much political power and coalition power and leadership across the South. And that's why we're thrilled to work with Black Voters Matter Fund on our report and working just across state and local and national leaders to really figure out what the new thing is going to be because it's not sitting here today. You have to think of every crisis as an opportunity. I think this crisis is going to create new opportunities. I also think, Jen, the overreach is going to be so severe that it's going to prepare us for the fall. If they start going for drawing James Clyburn out of South Carolina and Betty Thompson out of Mississippi and Terry Sewell out of Alabama, the naked racism and hatred is going to be so on Front Street. If they actually go down that path, it is going to be outrageous and galvanizing. And if they try to send the National Guard in to enforce decisions and try to jam maps down our throat, if that is what the first half of the year looks like, if that's really what we're going to go into, which is certainly looks possible based on everything we are seeing, I hope that's not what happens. We'll certainly be fighting that. But if that's what they do, and we all have to fight that, they all need to watch it because we're going to be so well organized by the fall. we're going to be so battle tested. We'll have figured out how to navigate that at a better level. And so again, this is tough stuff, but I think if this is the first half of the year in the South, what we're going to need from our northern friends is a ton of solidarity. That looks like donations. That looks like busing down here. That looks like helping us get through the finish line. Because I got good news. We have a dynamic Democratic Black U.S. Senate candidate in Mississippi named Scott Cologne. You have John Ossoff on the ballot. You have Roy Cooper on the ballot. You have a Senate race in Louisiana that could get very interesting. You have Texas Senate race. We could put the Senate in play through the South, and I believe
Absolutely.
whatever happens with Calais is going to directly tie into that.
Right. And don't sleep on governor races either,
A
folks,
hundred percent.
because governors are the ones who sign the redistricting maps.
That's right.
Governors are the one who can very heavily influence the federal elections and the sanctity of the electoral college votes.
That's right.
And, when you have people like Tommy Tuberville up against
That's right.
Doug Jones. Aside from all the jokes about the IQ teeter-totter being badly tipped in one direction, that also means you have an opportunity to do some
That's right.
real good. So, Lauren, thank you so much for all of the work you do, for your cogent explanations. We are going to follow this day in, day out next year. We encourage our contrarians, folks, you're always looking for things to do. Fair fight action. There you go. That's one thing you could do. So it's been a pleasure getting to know you and watching your work, and best of luck and happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays, Jen. Take care.